School shootings have become an unfortunate part of our reality. With one clear truth: that there is no one solution. Instead, there are many different pieces that must come together to mitigate this issue. Today, Dr. Fawzia Atcha of IMRON Corporation will be speaking with Lieutenant Mike Betzler. Lieutenant Betzler is a member of the police operations at Saddleback College located in Mission Viejo, California. In their discussion, Lieutenant Betzler, who has visited many campuses nationwide and spoken at various engagements, provides insight on school shootings from a security perspective.
Lieutenant Mike Betzler, thank you so much for being here today. We know you have a very busy schedule, so really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We know that you have a very impressive background. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Oh, I don't know that it's really impressive, but I did 29 years with the Orange County Sheriff's Department. 11 of those years was tactical. During that time, I was very fortunate to work for a progressive department that took a hard look at active shooters and actually sent teams of us out to active shooter situations where we could study, bring back lessons learned and ways to shape our response to those things and deal with that threat. After that, I got the opportunity to work for a couple consulting firms. One was Kroll Advisory, which actually ended up leading to a full-time job at the Los Angeles Dodgers. I also did some work with Raytheon looking at technology and law enforcement, taking technology from the battlefield and where we could leverage some of that technology in law enforcement to create a safer a world. Those things were brought over, and then worked for Los Angeles Dodgers for a couple years. A challenging job, like most challenges in life. I learned a lot there. Was released from there in 2014, and then ended up at Saddleback College, working with some old colleagues of mine and working in higher education. And I've done that for about the last 7 years, and I know we're going to lead into talking about access control, but that's how I really got exposed to access control on a higher level. I got a little bit of experience with it at the Sheriff's Department. Actually, at Los Angeles Dodgers, we did do some electronic access control there and start to kind of see some of the values of that and how to leverage the technology. But it really wasn't until I got to Saddleback College that I really started to learn about electronic access control and started to develop some ideas and some concepts about how to leverage that.
Okay, so Lieutenant Betzler, can you tell us what your role is at Saddleback?
I'm just a police operations lieutenant. We're a very small department. Saddleback College has about 25,000 total students, but that's about 7,000 full-time equivalent. So we have a very small department. We have 12 sworn officer positions. 10 of those are full-time, and it's the chief of police and myself right underneath him. So we have to wear a variety of hats. And one of the hats that I wear at the department is sometimes I'm called in to address issues with access control, manage the access control system from a end user perspective at the college. And then sometimes I sit in on construction meetings and give advice about how we're going to approach certain issues, new construction, retrofit, which was a big issue for Saddleback College. And so that's kind of where I'm at today.
Okay, and that's great to hear, and it's very impressive because your background has continued and it's kind of evolved with technology.
Yes, and as you can see, I'm not a young man. I'm not always very savvy with technology, but at the same time, I understand how this technology can help create a safer environment at our campus. And if our students, faculty, and staff are concerned about safety issues, and that takes away from their primary duties, which is learning or teaching our students, then that becomes a concern of mine. And I'm a firm believer, and I'm a little bit more mature now, but I understand some of the concepts of community-oriented policing and making sure that our community feels safe while they're on campus. And we believe that's critical to the learning environment.
That's really good to hear, especially in light with what's occurring today. We talk about school shootings, mass shootings, which has become an epidemic, is what they call it now. There's a lot of statistics out there. One in particular that I read was so far in 2022, there are 125 active gunfire on school grounds, of which 43 which has resulted in 43 deaths and 91 injuries. And of the 43 deaths, 21 come from Uvalde. So mass shootings and school shootings seem to be it's a very tragic occurrence and a tragic reality today. But it appears to be a multifaceted problem. There is not one solution that can say, hey, I'm going to eliminate this epidemic. So it seems like there's a lot of tangibles and intangibles that must come together in order to address this. Now, you've participated in a lot of speaking engagements with campus safety. You have visited many campuses throughout the country to this end. In your opinion, do you believe that electronic access control can mitigate or address some portion of school shootings?
Absolutely. I think, COVID kind of, what's interesting statistically, if you looked at the 2021 FBI report, not school shootings, but active shooters in the United States have gone up over 90% in the last 2 years from 2019. So 2020 and 21, 21 statistics over 19 statistics, over 90% increase. And to your point, Uvalde's it's a big example of what we're facing today. And it's interesting when you think of the technology that goes into that. I absolutely think it's one that should be considered for higher education. I've actually spoken to at least one elected official who expressed interest in maybe making this a standard in the educational environment. Because the other technologies that are out there, law enforcement, I think we tend to do a pretty good job with that. Uvalde's an exception to that, certainly. And I don't want to be critical of officers that are on the ground there. But certainly I believe we could always do better. And I think that's an example of that. But the other technologies that are out there, and we have a very good video management system, and we're glad to have it. It's very useful, but it tends to be more evidentiary. It's after the fact. It's forensics, where access control has the ability, and not only with the police department, but at the individual classroom and office level. It gives people the ability to lock their office, lock out all other access control cards except for the ones utilized by the police department, public safety ones. And it also alerts the police department, on our campus at least, that someone has made or activated that lock. Are there false alarms? Yes, there are. And that's fine. And we're able to resolve those. Our primary response is to send a uniformed officer over there to address that. Sometimes where we have a problem area, sometimes we'll try to resolve it with a phone call too. But at least we get a uniformed officer over there, because we know statistically too, and I'm kind of a statistics person, that contact with a law enforcement officer tends to take them out of their primary goal of gaining additional victims when we're talking about active shooter situations. Gets them out of that killing mode and gets them to focus on us, and that's why we choose to send a uniform officer to all of those. And I like that you were talking about some of the statistics for school shootings, because I know when I talk about these things, we tend to focus on the big ticket item was as active shooter.
Right.
But really, I talk about it on a campus violence perspective too, because if there's violence in the hallway or violence outside that door, you can push the button and you can lock that violence outside of your particular classroom. It doesn't have to be an active shooter. It doesn't have to be that. It could be anything.
It can contain the escalation with that.
Absolutely, and keep people from penetrating farther into the building.
Right.
We actually have created a kind of mid-range response on our campus, which when we say lock down, that means we lock every door and only public safety officers can unlock that door. Of course, our system does not interfere with egress during that time period that we have them locked, but we also have a lock out mode where we just basically lock all the doors, because many classrooms are in on-lock mode during the school day to allow free ingress for our students and staff, so that they're not forced to unlock the door every time. Students don't have access control cards, at least at this point in time on our campus. And that lockout mode actually provides an additional level of safety. If we had a threat off campus, we can shift the campus into a lockout mode, which just basically locks those exterior classroom doors and exterior doors to those buildings, which limits unauthorized personnel from being able to penetrate into our buildings deeper, and we don't even have to disrupt the classroom. Sometimes if you looked at a Virginia Tech after action report, and one of the top criticisms for Virginia Tech is information wasn't pushed out in a timely enough manner. And having studied these things, it's very difficult to balance response with the need and desire to get information pushed out. What's nice about electronic access control and how we leverage it at Saddleback College is we're able to lock those doors prior to being able to push out information. Even before we know what's going on, we're able to lock those doors and provide some level of safety.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. For those schools, campuses that say, hey, we want something like this, but we don't have the budget for it, how do you address those comments?
Well, and I talk about those very issues when I do my presentations, and I'll be honest with you, when we talk about Saddleback College, we were talking about 1,500 doors initially, and about 1,400 end users. So that's a lot of doors to retrofit, and retrofitting is always more expensive than initial construction. We had initially set aside about $10 million for that project. $10 million sounds like a lot, but when you compare it to the rest of the operational budget for those years, it's not that much money. Luckily, I worked for an administration at the time that saw the threat, recognized our ability to increase safety on campus at a reasonable amount, and our hard key system, quite frankly, had some other challenges to it. It had been a long time since the entire campus was rekeyed. We had several different keyways out there. Anybody that works with a hard key system understands that once keys are lost or misplaced or not turned in, your system's compromised on some level, and access control just doesn't have those vulnerabilities. So the decision was made to do that. At one point in time during the construction project, to retrofit our entire campus, we were projecting out about $7 million. So we were about 30% under budget, which is unheard of in the construction project world.
Right.
So we were heading down that road, but then regulations requiring us to do upgrades for ADA kind of pushed that money back into the project and forced us to do some things that were important to do, but it got lumped into the same project. But I think the good news on this, Fawzia, is talking to our construction manager on that project, who's somebody who still does a lot of work on our campus and currently they're doing some projects now, is really, when we're talking about new construction, we're only really talking about 2 to 3% increase over total construction costs. And I'm not being critical of these things, but when we talk about, and talking to my same expert there, and I would consider him an expert, he says it's probably over 10% goes into meeting fire code. Additional 10% of that budget goes into meeting ADA standards versus other construction projects that don't have the stringent ADA standards. And I'm not recommending that we put less money towards that. But to your point, in higher education environments, we've done an amazing job of dealing with the threat of fire in higher education. You don't hear of kids getting injured or killed in fire incidents in higher education.
Right.
It's violence. And, there is no standard out there that says you have to do these things to address the threat of violence on campus. There's just nothing out there.
Exactly.
And so why we certainly, I think it's vitally important that we address the issues of ADA access and fire code and fire protection, that we spend nothing on dealing with the violence threat. If we could in construction, to me, I don't know how we're going to be able to continue to do this. I think it's a technology that's time has come, and I think at some point in time it's probably going to get folded into standards. I would at least hope until we come up with a better solution. But when we talk about, when you look at the other solutions that people are providing out there, whether they're it's hard key solutions or mechanical solutions, there's aftermarket stuff that clearly would interfere with ingress for emergency personnel and could interfere with egress for people trying to get out of those situations. When I do my presentations, sometimes I just give people examples, and I think it was a 2019 example of a Southern California state college that had a lockdown, and there's a pile of chairs up against the door.
Oh my gosh!
And that's a plan, and a plan is better than no plan.
Right.
But in the 21st century, with all the money that's out there, and higher education, we understand the importance of technology. I think it's just a concept that's time is here. When are we as a society going to address that in a way that's reasonable? I hear these other solutions, and some of them are politically driven. But if you looked at the statistics, you look at the 2021 FBI report on active shooters, over 60% of those shootings people are utilizing handguns.
Right.
And so the one that I actually went to in Fort Hood with Nadal Hassan, he's only armed with 2 handguns. And I say only, but he's able to create a massive amount of damage with 2 handguns, primarily only shot one of those 2 handguns during his rampage, and was neutralized by law enforcement. But efforts to outlaw assault weapons, and they're used in some of these instances. But when I go and talk about these things, I bring up 2 of the major ones, which is Virginia Tech and Columbine, and neither one of those 2 instances involve assault rifles. So that's one piece of it,
right.
Maybe, but you deal with that, and it doesn't deal with the full problem. I think electronic access control, while it might not be the total solution, I think it's the one thing that we can do, that we can put in the hands of our students, faculty, and staff that's proactive. It gets in front of the problem instead of reactive.
Absolutely.
People can take a proactive approach.
Right.
There was a shooting at Santa Monica College. A former colleague of mine was the chief there during that time, and there was an HBO special. And I think it's very telling. And if you watch that HBO special on that shooting in particular, and it's very well done, they interviewed a librarian, and She is in the library when the shooter walks in. He identifies himself as law enforcement. She trusts her senses and rightfully so, doesn't believe him. So she makes her way over to a small storage room. I think there's a couple other people in the storage room, and she manages to get inside the storage room and lock the door.
Oh my gosh.
The shooter actually comes up to the door, demands entry.
Oh, wow.
When nobody responds, he actually shoots the lock and tries to defeat the lock that way and shoots into the room. He hits no one. It is neutralized by law enforcement right on the other side of that. And, I give other examples particularly from Virginia Tech. I've heard a lady by the name of Lisa Hamp talk about her experiences at Virginia Tech, where as a young student, she was in Norris Hall when Cho was actively shooting. He tried to gain access into the classroom. They had no ability to lock that door. And her and several other students laid on the floor and held the door closed while Cho shot through the door over their heads.
Oh my gosh.
And I just got to believe in the 21st century that with all the technology we have, we could come up with something better than lying on the floor.
Absolutely.
Or stacking up chairs, or a hard mechanical thing that we put on a door that interferes with first responders, or potentially interferes with egress if that's necessary. And I honestly, if there was something better than electronic access control, I'd say it right now. I don't have another better solution right now that fits that criteria. Certainly law enforcement response, I think, is critical to that. We need to get there quick. We need to actively engage that shooter. But what do we do in that response time? And I think response times are going up. When I first started talking about active shooter, average response times or average active times for active shooters was probably in the 5 to 7 minute range. I think those times are going up now. Law enforcement response is probably better, but 5 minutes is a long time.
It is.
If you're waiting for somebody to come and deal with a threat. One study I read about Virginia Tech said Cho while he was actively shooting in Norris Hall, he was averaging killing one student every 18 seconds. So what are we doing in that 5 minutes or 7 minutes it takes law enforcement to get on scene? And what can people do to protect themselves in that time frame? Because that's when we're losing lives.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I want to come back to what you had mentioned about being a proactive stance, right? We have to take a proactive stance. I think when Uvalde occurred at Robb Elementary, there were several interviews that I listened to. I couldn't watch the video footage that was disseminated in media. It was just too disheartening. It was very difficult to watch. But from that, I listened to interviews from parents who escaped with kids, their children escaped the very tragic outcome that could have happened. I heard interviews from parents whose children did not. But then there was one interview actually from a parent that I think held it resonated with me more than anything else. And it comes back to your point. She had said that this is an epidemic and you hear about it so often that you become numb. And you become so numb that you start accepting this tragedy and these tragic events and think, okay, this is going to occur. This is our reality. So when you've accepted this tragic reality, then the stance becomes, okay, it's going to happen. There's nothing we can do. We just have to go through this process. But again, if we turn that around and become more proactive and not make this or not accept this as being what it is, as being part of our reality, that by being proactive, we're going to do something to mitigate whatever we can mitigate. And again, to your comment, it's about taking that proactive stance, coupling it with as many solutions as you can, and developing something that could be implemented, something that could be addressed in so many ways.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think that, and I didn't see that interview, but I think that that person's comments are timely. But I think many of us, and we're still under the false impression that it can't happen to me, or it won't happen to me. And I'll give you a personal example of that. And I'm probably guilty of it a little bit myself, having that same perspective. But this one kind of changed me a little bit and made it more personal for me. So my daughter, who was in college at the time and was attending TCU, went to the Route 91 concert in 2017 in October 1st. She was there with one of her sorority sisters, was there late that Sunday night, had great seats like right in front of the stage. Very excited. I can't remember the artist who was coming up, but one of my daughter's favorites. And I apologize, I'm not going to give out this other girl's name, but I guess she asked my daughter to accompany her to go to the restroom, which was some distance away. They walked to the restroom, and when they got near the restrooms, my daughter heard what she rightfully believed to be gunfire, and she made a quick determination assessment and told her friend that we need to run away from where she perceived the threat. And so within a few seconds of running, she feels something hit her foot, and in one conversation with her, she said to me, she goes, I was like in disbelief. It's like, that did not just happen to me. I did not just get shot. And unbeknownst to her friend, she was probably potentially hit with a piece of the same bullet, likely skipped off the ground and hit my daughter in the foot, and a piece of that hit her friend in the calf. They were able to run. But at one point, to get out from that stadium, when we talk about egress, some patrons there, and I wish I could find them because I'd love to give them a hug. But some young men were holding the bottom of the fence up so people could escape.
Oh my gosh!
And get out of that area. And so my daughter was able to make it back to her hotel room with her mom. But it made it very personal for me. And so one of the things that I guess a regret I have is, I talked to my daughter about many safety, law enforcement related things that she might encounter. I talked about driving safety. I talked about, safety in all these areas. But the one thing I never really talked to her about was an active shooter situation. And I have to be honest with you, I didn't think it would happen to her.
Of course.
It wasn't that important to me, or at the time, it didn't seem like a viable potential threat to her that I needed to address with her. Now, luckily, she made great decisions that day, but it wasn't because I told her about stuff. Yet here I am, a 30-plus year law enforcement officer with all this tactical experience and studied active shooter, yet I never had that conversation with my daughter. So my perspective's changed, and what I like to encourage people, and I've heard other speakers talk about this, and I give real life examples when I talk about it. Some of these other victims is, in this day and age, we can't say it's never going to happen to us, because it could. And there were other friends that I had that were there, close personal friends and coworkers, and this happens in a nearby state in Las Vegas. If you looked at 2021 FBI statistics on active shooter, California leads the nation with 42. So if you're a resident of California, and we live and work in a very safe area,
right?
But it could happen, and it could happen here.
Right.
And certainly has already happened in our county. What's interesting is I used to talk about active shooter, and we've had a couple of instances qualify now since then, since I first started. But way back when, the largest mass killing that had happened in Orange County before the one that occurred at Seal Beach at the the beauty salon or whatever was Cal State Fullerton.
Huh.
So people didn't know about that. I believe it happened in the 70s. So that's old news. But you know, when I tend to talk to people about educational environments, and you know, there's plenty of examples out there. And if I had my list over there, I could probably run down for them pretty quick. But I mean, you don't have to go very long on the news to see something involving an educational environment and
Mm-hmm.
active shooter. You won't have to watch the news very, very long. In fact, when I would do my presentations, I would change my PowerPoint. I'd have to change it almost every time because I wanted to include the most recent one on one of my initial slides.
So with this, final thoughts, what do you say to schools, higher education? What is your recommendation now in terms of maybe enacting a policy, maybe implementing a security solution, maybe looking at like behaviors, social media? There's so many facets, right? So many things. Like, what would be your recommendation?
You really touched on some really important ones there, Fawzia. You know, we have a behavioral intervention team. You know, we try to get in front of threats. We try to identify them beforehand. When I watch the news and I see these things, there's always criticism of, boy, couldn't they have seen this thing coming? And whether they could or couldn't, you know, and having been involved in a lot of these things, it's, you know, you might see a potential threat out there, but mm-hmm. From a law enforcement perspective, they're not always actionable. I mean, to think of 25,000 students, is there anybody there that is, you know, has mental or emotional problems or just having a really bad day or week? I mean,
right.
Clearly those things are occurring. I think you're exactly right. I think coming up with a comprehensive plan, and that's what I push in my things, and I say access control is only a piece of that. We really need to talk about the things that we can do ahead of time. I have a background in emergency management too, and there was somebody who told this to me way back when. They said, we never want to have a conversation at a crime scene or at an incident command post about how we're going to respond to something that we could have had in a nice air-conditioned office over a cup of coffee. And so that planning piece is so critical, and to have a plan ahead of time to work with all the responding agencies that they're going to respond on game day, and have a working relationship, plan with them, exercise with them, train with them, and have that response. But look at it, and how do we, you know, that intelligence piece is really about mitigation. But what can we do in advance? And you know, how do we make our environment, whether it's a college campus or it's an educational environment, or, you know, if you looked at the FBI statistics, it's really businesses are the ones that are primarily targeted for these things. Is what could you do on game day that if you were going to build a building or do some tenant improvements or whatever, what could we do to increase the safety of these things, and put those things into place? Mm-hmm. And that's where, you know, access control, when we look at it in its totality, what it provides to the college, I mean, it's so much better than what we did before with a hard key system, not just from a safety perspective. And that was one of the primary focuses when we began the process, was we wanted to emphasize that our access control system was a safety system. It's an amazing security system too, and does many things. And quite frankly, we don't always leverage it to our best ability. We bought a Ferrari and we drive it like a you know, a Corolla, but nothing wrong with Corollas. I drove a Toyota here today, but you know, it's really so multifaceted. It's having a complete plan and then working towards that, because and I've heard some people talk about it, and one was a school administrator where they had a school shooting where he got to view his decisions in hindsight. And I love his candor and his honesty, because he said, you know, I had an opportunity to do some stuff in advance, and I didn't do those things, and now I regret it, and I wish I'd done things different. And it, you know, heaven forbid one of those incidents visits your campus, your business, your event, and there's going to be a million things that you're going to be faced with, but what could you have done? What's reasonable that you could do in advance? You could certainly plan. You could certainly have a plan. And when I'm such a proponent of electronic access control, that retrofit, it's challenging. But you know, I encourage people, we don't have to eat the whole elephant today. You know, we could eat it in bites.
Absolutely.
Could we start with any new construction? And then put in the head end and create a system that you could build upon. And then as you do retrofit projects, or you work on a building, or you do tenant improvements, can we build that into our standard, that if we're going to touch that door, we're going to build those standards in. And then you could start to address it that way. And then I encourage people. I mean, I'm not a hired gun. I don't work for IMRON. I intentionally don't take anything from anyone because I want to be able to go out and speak freely on this thing. You know, that electronic access control is pretty cheap in my mind when you're talking about dealing with this threat. If you only put in 2 to 3% into a construction project, or you know, I mean, I sit in these meetings, let's just all be honest here. But I mean, you guys have beautiful offices here. I mean, what if we shaved 2 to 3% of the aesthetic qualities of our construction project and built that into a safety system that would serve our people on a really bad day? And it doesn't have to be active shooter. It could be an act of violence. It could be something else. And it's also a tremendous safety or security system. I mean, we've already addressed some pretty significant issues from a security perspective with this system too. And then the retrofit thing, I think if you create standards first of what you want to accomplish, you do your research out there, and I always tell everybody, please do your research. You're welcome to come to Saddleback College and come visit me and talk to me. I'll talk all day. Clearly, you guys see that I'll talk a lot about this, but go talk to some other people out there. There's some other amazing places out there. I think BYU's got a pretty impressive system out there. There's some other places out there doing some amazing things. We went to American River College, like we talked about, specifically to go look at how they were leveraging the IMRON system, and it gave us a tremendous starting point. I think it was some of the best money we ever spent on our project was just to send some representatives. And you know, going way back when, this project was not one that was driven by the police department. And in the beginning, quite frankly, it was driven by faculty and staff who had a concern, saw these things happening out there, and said, wow, if we had something like this, what would I do on that day? Or do I just hide under my desk and wait for the police to get here? Which is not a good, you know, I believe it's FEMA, our Department of Homeland Security puts out a video that we provide on our website at the college, which is called Run, Hide, Fight. And it's pretty well done, and I think it gives people options, and we encourage them to look at the options. But you know, when I go and talk about this, I say, you know, hiding under your desk in an active shooter situation is not a good plan, and it's not good. It's not a good tactic for you. I can, you know, we can go back to Columbine and in graphic detail show why that doesn't work. Hiding under a desk. Quite frankly, I tell people, like, hey, you know, if you got a chance to bust out of that area and put some distance between you and the threat, under those circumstances, you can't lock your door, you can't get into a locked area, you know the threat's close by, put distance between you. So those are all part of the plans, and I think you got to have a comprehensive one. And I think access control, if you looked at any college or any educational environment, we're going to talk about lockdowns. If an incident happened, and certainly happened at my daughter's high school, happened at my youngest daughter's middle school, they had some lockdowns there when there was a threat off campus. My older daughter had one on campus, and they lock them down. How do they achieve that? And who can get in that door? Access control, it's pretty easy. Anybody can operate it. We have one way that we do it, but there's probably limitless ways that you can do it. But take into account all the challenges that brings. Think about egress and first responders. I used to. It was a mechanical device. I don't know. Can I talk about lock block? Maybe I just said it. But honestly, I think it's pretty ingenious. And as a mechanical device, it's pretty interesting. And we talked about it early on, considered it on some levels. But it didn't meet fire code. So are we going to violate fire code to increase safety? Is there a better solution to that? And then lock block. I mean, it's not smart technology. It doesn't alert anybody that there's a threat. It's just one way to lock a door.
Right.
And to do that. So whatever resources you have, do those things. And if you ever wanted to talk about electronic access control, clearly I've got some opinions, and I love to talk about it because I think it definitely has the potential to save lives. I think you're gonna see some examples of that in the not too distant future. I can point to Santa Monica College, and I can point to places like Virginia Tech, where being able to lock a door, secure a door. In fact, in Parkland, it came into play there. There's one kid that I talk about there. I think he was shot multiple times trying to hold the door closed. To protect his classmates and protect his class, a 15-year-old young man. He's a young man, and he's still alive today. But my gosh, that was his only option. Yeah. Like, is there a better way?
Right.
I clearly, I think there is. I think electronic access control, as far as being able to secure a door and secure it in a way that's best in that environment, I think till a better solution comes along. I think when you think lockdown and actionable by non-law enforcement personnel, I think that's one of our best options.
Thank you. Lieutenant Betzler, you're a great advocate for children and the safety of kids, and you're creating this great awareness of physical security, and we really appreciate that, and we really like to thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
For more information, please visit our website at imron.com.